There's four mechanics I have seen used through basically all current card games that I keep seeing being used, but it seems people just seem to indirectly mention them without even really thinking about them. And if they are noticed, it's only when their existence or sometimes lack thereof is realized by that card community to exploit the card, usually for a broken combo. Even then, however, I have seen no one use a one or two word term for this so called mechanic that I reference. I tried looking up good general rules on creating card games to see if they would mention these at all, but they too don't seem to mention this mechanic. Not only that, but I'm not even sure if the word mechanic is appropriate because they're not effects we usually think of like rush or assail or ward, which we think of when we say it, but I'm not sure what else to call them other than a mechanic. So for this video, I'll keep using the word. If you know a better word, please let me know in the comments because I feel like I'm being a pioneer with creating the terminology, but also try to stay humble enough to know that I can't be the first one to talk about these mechanics and create words to describe them. So by now you're probably saying, Donut, what am I talking about, and how do these five cards relate to these four mechanics that you're talking about? Well, good question. And these four mechanics can be kind of arranged in a two by two grid. So let me show you that, and we'll go over them, and then I'll talk about them. So here's the 2 by 2 grid. On the left side, you have the word explicit and implicit, and above, you have the word exception and allowance. And so by kind of combining the two words together, you've got four boxes. You've got the explicit exception, the explicit allowance, the implicit exception, and the implicit allowance. Starting with the explicit implicit side, that is in reference to whether the card is being referenced or not. And the exception or allowance is whether the card itself can be chosen uh, with its own effect or not. So let's start with the explicit exception. With explicit exception, the card on the effect is directly referenced as being an option that cannot be selected. So, in the example of Rice Shower here in her last words, it says select an Uma Musume follower with a different name from this card in your cemetery and add it to your hand. So, it's being explicitly accepted from being chosen as an option. And I know there's going to be a lot of people that say, well, donut, no duh. There's a lot of cards that say, you can't choose the card that this could be chosen as an option for. But I think that's a little bit more to it than just that. And maybe talking about the other three might help too. But it actually took me a minute to actually realize what uh, card in Shadowverse would have this explicit exception because I actually had to like kind of think real hard for a couple minutes and kind of actually start delving through the card list to find a card in Shadowverse with an explicit exception on it. Game seems to be really good, and I'll kind of say why I say good, but a little bit later on. But Game seems to be really good at making sure cards don't need these explicit exceptions unless they absolutely need them, because they tend to use other mechanics or other traits or attributes or stats to get around having to say this. And I appreciate and respect that about this game because there's a lot of other games that seem to just be totally fine with adding this extra bit of text, and which can add to the general view and complexity of a card game as looking more complicated than it really is. But let me, you might kind of think like, okay, I'm over exaggerating, but let me just kind of show you the other examples and just why I think this just kind of matters in the grander scheme of card design in general. So here we'll put the Rice Shower card in the explicit exception box. So let's move over to an explicit allowance. So if we take the concept from explicit exception and kind of shift it over to explicit allowance is a effect that explicitly allows you to grab a card. So for an example, with Cougar Pelt Warrior here, it's 3 cost 3/2. You pay 1 to Evo it. And on Evolve, you search your deck for an explicitly allowed copy of itself, and then you put it onto the field engaged, and then you shuffle your deck. So in this case, the card is explicitly saying can search your deck for this card. It's explicitly allowing it. So there we have explicit allowance and Cougar Pelt Warrior underneath. I think explicit allowance is probably kind of the easiest to kind of wrap your head around. I don't think any of these are super crazy ideas, but it's at least the most easy to understand. Moving down to the implicit row, though, with implicit exception, that is next. And I think the implicit row is a little more. Requires a little more insight to pull off correctly, which, as far as I can tell, as somebody who does enjoy kind of card game design, especially when I play the games and I see how things interact, I think Cygames has done a pretty good job at keeping things balanced because of how they design cards and implicit exception, and to a certain degree, implicit allowance too. So the example I'm going to use for implicit exception is Hell's Unleasher here. It's a 2-cost 2/2 that you may tap it and put it to the cemetery to select a follower that costs at least 3 play points in the cemetery and add it back to your hand. And as you read this, you might kind of realize the implicit exception, but I'll kind of just spit it out to make sure it's obvious. But he's a 2-cost follower, and his effect only allows 3 cost or higher followers to be grabbed. So, in that regards, for game design and game purposes, it requires less text on the card, which therefore makes the card feel more readable and legible. And to the average person who might not know card games, or at least not this card game specifically, kind of makes the text feel less overwhelming. And not to explicitly bash any certain card game, but there are card games that tend to have a lot of text on them in small font, and it's very off-putting for people to even want to try to wrap their head around, where by having less text on a card, not only do you have the nicer aesthetic of being able to see more of the art underneath, but to a new person who is just trying to even read a card, it is less bits of information that they need to kind of juggle in their head to even think about what the card does. And it's not even needed to be said. So what's nice too is no one needs to explicitly say, this card cannot be grabbed, because just by the state of its properties, it's just not even an option. You don't need to think further in your mind about whether it can or can't, because it just can't, from the simple fact of its stats. And maybe I'm nerding about this harder than most people would even think, and just be like, yep, that's just how it is, whip-de-doo. But there's a kind of, seems like pre-planning that comes with this, and maybe it's not so noticed with Hell's Unleasher. I actually have another video that has me going over another card that is just riddled with implicit acceptances. Like almost to a shocking degree. And I don't want to say the card right now just for the sake of, kind of making a debate, but only it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong to a certain degree, and I'm certainly open for, debate, but it seems like the better planned out cards are in a card game, it seems like the more they can get away with having implicit exceptions, which therefore makes the card look better, which therefore makes better gameplay design and better card reading. And they may not be really noticed on Hell's Unleasher, but there's another card that actually will circle back around to Hell's Unleasher later. Like I said, I'll make a video about that kind of made me really start to think and realize, like, wow, like, Cygames, when they were designing these cards, kind of really kind of thought ahead more than just like 1 or 2 sets. And I think if I remember correctly, I remember hearing that they kind of design about 4 to 5 sets at a time. But even then, it's like, kind of depending on all the design and everything, it's like it's still very easy for a developer to get lost in the sauce, so to speak. So kind of just want to kind of give props to Cygames for their card design. So coming back around to the chart, we will throw the Hell's Unleasher in the implicit exception pile, and let's shift over to the last one, implicit allowance. So with implicit allowance, that is where the card will allow you to grab another copy of the same card, even if it's not explicitly set. So therefore, it's not set explicitly. It is implicit that you can grab it. So in the example of that mechanic is Undead King, where on Fanfare you select up to 2 followers in your cemetery and add them to your hand. The idea being, in theory, granted, I know Undead King is not a good card, but in theory, you can play it, grab another copy of Undead King and a different follower. Obviously, it's a 6 cost, so you can't just play down the Undead King, so you have to wait around until you come back around to your next turn, and you could, in theory, again, play the Undead King you return to hand, and if the previous Undead King was killed last turn, then you could grab it back. So in theory, you could loop these cards around forever, but due to mechanics of there being up to 10 play points in a turn, that also implicitly means that you can't play more than one Undead King a turn, which kind of keeps this mechanic from being some kind of like broken loop. Not even at 5, I don't think it'd be a broken loop, but like let's say Undead King was in theory 0 play points, you could, be like Undead King, grab 2 cards, and one would be Undead King. Play another Undead King, grab another card and another copy of Undead King. Play the third Undead King, grab 2 more cards. Like, that would just be an insane amount of value. And so by having it be 6, it is also kneecapping the implicit allowance from being too strong and kind of running away with the game and running away with too much advantage. In card game design wise, I just find this fascinating in regards to Shadowverse, because all of this gets to be implied and none of this has to fill up a small box of text on the card itself. There's no grab 2 followers, but if you grab Undead King, you can't, summon him this turn. You have to wait till next turn, and all that kind of like extra fluff that kind of comes with explicit exceptions, which just, in general makes the card look neater and the card quality look better, and you can just, see more art. Imagine all that extra text covering up, let's say, the tomb there that he's grabbing. That'd just be a lot of kind of pointless fluff that if a new person tried to read, they'd just be like, whoa, like, okay, calm down there, hombre. It's this is a little overwhelming. I'm not totally getting all this mechanic, but with the way the game is designed, they don't need to add all that extra fluff, and so out comes a simple 6 cost 6/6 that just lets you grab 2 followers from the cemetery. Everything's just kind of, implied, and just as you play the game, you'll just notice these unwritten rules that Cygame has kind of written into their cards. And so finally, we will put Undead King in the implicit allowance section. So you might be wondering, like, Donut, that's cool, but what does this matter? And I guess I find terminology to be very important when it comes to trying to explain things. And when you start to get to larger concepts of like game design, or you're trying to talk about how one card might interact with another card, in the case of, let's just say, Undead King, for example, you can, instead of saying, Undead King can grab 2 cards, including itself, you can be like, Undead King's effect is just an implicit allowance. So, therefore it can be grabbed by its own effect. But that being said, obviously I just kind of threw the 2 words in there and still explained the situation. But if you're kind of talking with a card game friend who might know these terms already, you might just tell them, oh yeah, there's this card, Undead King, on Fanfare lets you grab 2 cards, and it's an implicit allowance, and they just may be like, oh, okay, cool, so then just in their mind, they're just like, that includes just grabbing itself, right? So, yeah, I kind of wanted to bring these up, and let me know if maybe I'm just reinventing the wheel and maybe there's already like terms for this, or there might be terms, but it might be more terms for other card games, but not Shadowverse. But once I kind of noticed these 4, like I said, mechanics, for lack of a better word, they just seem to appear almost everywhere. Like, it was almost to a shocking degree, at least in Shadowverse, where not so much explicit exception and explicit allowance. Those are actually the ones I found harder to find. But the implicit exceptions and implicit allowances just almost seem to be like everywhere almost on every card in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not literally every card, but like as I was looking at cards and I was like thinking of things, it just seemed to be everywhere, and even so much more than just like searching. Like for an example, just I'll bring up Whispers of a Dream real quick. You know, it's it has an implicit exception just because of the ability to not be able to destroy itself, right? It's a card that costs 2, destroys a 3 cost follower. And so the implicit exception here, and I get it, this is maybe a tiny bit of a stretch, but the card itself is a spell, so it can't be destroyed by its own effect. So it's implicitly an exception to being a target of its own destruction. Another example maybe is like Death's Breath, where it says res a 8 cost or less follower, and because Death's Breath is a spell, instead of like let's say they made Death's Breath a follower, for example, that might be like a 6 cost follower that says fanfare, revive an 8 cost follower from the cemetery. But they didn't have to say that, resurrect a 6 cost follower from the cemetery, except Death's Breath, right? They didn't need to add that kind of exception because they just made it a spell. And because it's a spell, it is inherently just an implicit exception to Death's Breath's own mechanic. So things like that, like, maybe they're a little bit of a stretch here and there, and that's why I try to kind of have more like obvious things, but just the way the cards are designed in general, and especially, like I said, one card I'm going to be like hopefully making a video here soon. I kind of have like the basic framework of it, but just those kind of like exceptions kind of makes cards look neater and need less text overall to explain what they need to do, and it causes less potential accidental infinite loops or really strong combos. So there you have it. My 4 mechanics that I don't know if technically have actual terms or not, but let me know what you guys think. Am I just kind of crazy, or is there something to it that I might be onto something, or is it something you guys noticed but never really thought of? Let me know. I'm honestly kind of curious. This is something that's kind of been like mentally chewing on my brain for a little while now, and I felt like I just need to kind of bring it up with other people and just see if I'm just like the first one who realized this and like made up my own terms for it, or maybe if there is actual terms. So let me know. Thanks. Bye.